Hello, my friends. I am so glad you are here with me today. Today, we are going to go on a journey. We are going to travel across the blue ocean to a beautiful city called Sydney in Australia. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a harbor. The water is sparkling under a bright sun. You see a building. It looks like white sails on a boat. It looks like giant seashells resting on the edge of the sea. This is the Sydney Opera House. It is one of the most famous buildings in the whole world. But did you know that this building was almost never finished? Its history is full of secrets, big fights, and broken hearts. It is a story about a grand dream that almost became a nightmare. Let's begin our story at the very beginning. In the late 1940s, the world was changing. World War II had ended. People in Australia wanted to build something new. They wanted to show the world that they were a modern and creative country. Sydney was a growing city, but it did not have a special place for music and art. At that time, if you wanted to see a big concert, you often had to go to a small town hall. The acoustics, that is, the way sound travels in a room, were not very good. The musicians were frustrated. The public wanted more. They wanted a home for the arts. In 1952, a man named Eugene Goossens became a leader in this movement. He was the director of the New South Wales Conservatorium of Music. He had a big vision. He said, "Sydney needs an opera house. Not just a small one, but a world-class center." People were excited. The government agreed. In 1955, they launched an international design competition. They invited architects from all over the world to send their ideas. They wanted something bold. They wanted something that would make people stop and stare. Imagine being an architect back then. You sit at your desk with a pencil and a blank piece of paper. You think about the harbor. You think about the wind and the water. What would you draw? The rules were simple, but the goal was huge. The building had to have two main halls. One hall was for large opera performances. The other was for smaller concerts and meetings. Over 230 architects from 32 different countries sent in their drawings. The judges looked at hundreds of designs. Many were boring. Many looked like square boxes or old stone buildings. But then, they found something different. They found a set of sketches that looked like nothing else in the world. These sketches did not look like a normal building. They looked like art. They looked like clouds or white sails catching the wind. The judges were amazed. Some were worried it was too difficult to build. But one judge, a famous architect named Eero Saarinen, saw the genius in it. He pulled the design out of the rejected pile and said, "This is the winner." The winner was a young man from Denmark. His name was Jørn Utzon. He was not famous yet. He lived far away in a quiet town. But he had a dream that would change Sydney forever. The city was buzzing with energy. A grand dream was born. Everyone was ready to start, but they did not know how hard the road ahead would be. Who was Jørn Utzon? He was a man who loved nature. He loved the shape of trees, the curves of mountains, and the way birds fly. When he designed the opera house, he wasn't thinking about bricks and straight lines. He was thinking about the sea. His design was revolutionary. Revolutionary means it was completely new and different. Usually, buildings have walls and a roof, but Utzon's design looked like it was made of giant white shells. He called them spherical geometry. Think about an orange. If you cut a large orange into pieces, the skin of each piece has the same curve. Utzon used this idea for the roof. He wanted the building to look beautiful from every side, even from the sky. He called it the fifth facade. The people of Sydney were very surprised. Some people loved it immediately. They thought it was poetic and magical. Other people were confused. They asked, "How will it stand up?" Or, "Is it a building or a giant sculpture?" Utzon moved his family to Australia. He was very happy and full of energy. He worked long hours. He wanted every detail to be perfect. He didn't just want a building, he wanted a masterpiece. He spent years studying the site at Benelong Point, the piece of land that sticks out into the water. But there was a problem, a very big problem. Utzon had the vision, but the technology of the 1950s was not ready for his ideas. There were no computers to help with the math. Engineers had to use slide rules and paper to calculate the weight of those massive concrete shells. The excitement was high, but the challenges were starting to grow. The government wanted to start building right away. They were afraid that if they waited, the public would lose interest. They pushed Utzon to start construction before the plans were even finished. Imagine building a giant Lego set without the instruction book. That is what it felt like. They started building the base, the podium, before they knew how the roof would stay up. Utzon was a perfectionist. He wanted special tiles for the roof. He spent years working with a company in Sweden to create the perfect Sydney tile. These tiles had to be white, but not too shiny so they wouldn't blind the sailors in the harbor. In the end, they used over 1 million tiles. When you look at the Opera House today, it looks pure white. But if you get close, you see it is a beautiful pattern of matte and glossy tiles. This was Utzon's magic. He saw the small things and the big things at the same time. But while Utzon was focusing on the beauty, the cost was going up. The project was taking much longer than expected. The bold stroke of his design was becoming a mountain of work. The honeymoon phase was ending, and the storm was coming. Building the Sydney Opera House was like trying to solve a puzzle that had never been solved before. My friends, it was incredibly difficult. The engineers were some of the best in the world, from a firm called Ova Arup, but even they were stuck. For 6 years, the engineers and Utzon argued about the roof. How do you build giant concrete shells that curve in the air? They tried many different shapes. They tried parabolas. They tried ellipses. Nothing worked. The concrete was too heavy. It would collapse. Imagine the frustration. The workers were already at the site. The giant base was finished, but there was no roof. People in the city started to get angry. They called it the white elephant. This is an English expression for something that is very expensive but useless. The costs were soaring. The original budget was 7 million Australian dollars, but soon it became 20 million, then 50 million. The government was worried. They had to start a special lottery just to pay for the building. Can you imagine that? People bought lottery tickets every week to help build a house for music. It shows how much the community was involved, even when they were frustrated. Finally, Utzon had a eureka moment, a sudden bright idea. This was the idea of the orange we talked about earlier. By making all the shells from the same sphere, they could use factory-made parts. This made the impossible building possible. But the work was dangerous and hard. Workers had to climb high into the air. They were building the most complex structure in the history of architecture. Every piece of concrete had to be moved by giant cranes that were specially made in France. Inside the building, things were also difficult. Utzon wanted the glass walls to look like they were hanging. He wanted the theaters to have perfect sound. He was constantly changing the plans to make them better. But the government was changing too. New leaders were elected. They did not care about art as much as the old leaders did. They cared about money. They cared about the schedule. They wanted the building finished quickly and cheaply. The tension between the creative architect and the practical politicians was like a fire. It grew and grew. Utzon was often lonely. He was a long way from home. He felt that the people in power did not understand his vision. Have you ever worked very hard on something, only to have someone tell you it's too expensive or taking too long? It's a very sad feeling. Utzon was fighting for his child, the Opera House, but the mountain of challenges was becoming too high to climb. The year was 1966. The atmosphere in Sydney was tense. A new Minister for Works, Davis Hughes, was in charge of the project. He did not get along with Jørn Utzon. He wanted to control the money, and he stopped paying Utzon's staff. Utzon was in a corner. He couldn't pay his workers. He couldn't finish his designs. He felt he had no choice. In a moment of great sadness and anger, Utzon wrote a letter. He resigned. He quit. He thought the government would ask him to come back. He thought they would say, "We are sorry, Jørn. Please stay and finish your masterpiece." But they didn't. They accepted his resignation. The news shocked the city. Thousands of people marched in the streets. They carried signs that said, "Bring Utzon back." Architects from all over the world wrote letters of protest. They knew that without Utzon, the building might lose its soul. But the government did not change its mind. Utzon was heartbroken. He packed his bags. He took his wife and children and left Australia. As his plane flew over Sydney Harbour, he looked down at his unfinished shells. He didn't know it then, but he would never return to Australia. He would never see his finished building in person. Can you imagine the pain? To spend 9 years of your life on a dream and then be forced to leave before it is done? A team of Australian architects was hired to finish the work. The exterior, the outside, was mostly finished, but the interior, the inside, was still a skeleton. The new team changed many of Utzon's designs for the inside. They changed the colors. They changed the layout of the theaters. Utzon's vision for a unified building, where the inside matched the outside, was lost. The project continued for 7 more years. It was a time of what-ifs. What if Utzon had stayed? What if the government had been more patient? The cost continued to rise, eventually reaching $102 million. That was 14 times more than the original price. But the building was finally nearing completion. The white shells were shining in the sun. Even with all the fighting and the sadness, the structure was undeniable. It was a miracle of engineering. The people of Sydney were still divided. Some saw it as a symbol of government failure. Others saw it as a triumph of human spirit. But as the opening day approached, the anger began to turn into curiosity. Everyone wanted to see what was inside the giant white shells. Finally, the day arrived. October 20th, 1973. It was a beautiful, sunny day in Sydney. The harbour was full of thousands of boats. The land was crowded with people. Queen Elizabeth II came from England to officially open the building. There were fireworks, balloons, and music everywhere. It was a massive celebration. The impossible building was finally open to the world. In her speech, the Queen said, "The Sydney Opera House has captured the imagination of the world." She was right. Even the critics who hated the project had to admit that the building was magnificent. But there was one person missing. Jørn Utzon was not invited. He was not mentioned in the official speeches. He was thousands of miles away in Denmark. It was a bittersweet victory. A bittersweet feeling is when you are happy about a success, but also sad about something else. The first performance in the big hall was Prokofiev's War and Peace. The music filled the space. People walked through the foyers and looked out at the water through the giant glass walls. They felt like they were inside a work of art. The public fell in love with it almost immediately. The white elephant was gone. In its place was a global icon. People forgot about the high costs and the long delays. They only saw the beauty. The Opera House became a busy hive of activity. There were operas, ballets, plays, and concerts. It wasn't just for rich people. It was for everyone. People could walk on the wide steps and enjoy the view. It became the heart of the city. In those first few years, the building proved it was more than just a pretty face. It worked. The acoustics were good. The space was inspiring. It became a place where the greatest artists in the world wanted to perform. But as the years passed, people began to realize that a mistake had been made. They realized that Utzon should have been there. They realized that his vision was what made the building special. Even though the opening was a triumph, the story wasn't quite over. There was still a hole in the heart of the project. The building was finished, but the relationship with its creator was still broken. Would the city ever make peace with the man who gave them their greatest treasure? Time has a way of healing old wounds. As the decades went by, the Sydney Opera House became the symbol of Australia. When people think of Australia, they think of the kangaroo, the outback, and the Opera House. In the late 1990s, the Sydney Opera House Trust reached out to Jørn Utzon. They wanted to fix the relationship. They asked him to come back as a consultant. They wanted his help to plan for the future of the building. Utzon was an old man then, but he accepted. He was very kind. He didn't show any bitterness. He said, "The building is like a child. You give it life, and then it grows up and has its own life." He worked with his son, Jørn Utzon, to create the Utzon design principles. These are rules to make sure that any future changes to the building stay true to his original vision. In 2003, Utzon received the Pritzker Prize. This is the highest honor an architect can receive. It is like the Nobel Prize for buildings. The judges said that the Sydney Opera House was one of the greatest buildings of the 20th century. Finally, in 2004, a room inside the Opera House was opened. It was designed exactly as Utzon wanted. They called it the Utzon Room. It was the first time his interior design was actually built inside the house. Jørn Utzon passed away in 2008 at the age of 90. He never saw the finished building with his own eyes, but in a way, he didn't need to. He knew every curve and every tile. He had lived inside that building in his mind for 50 years. Today, the Sydney Opera House is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This means it is protected as a treasure for all of humanity. It hosts more than 1,500 performances every year. Millions of people visit it from every corner of the globe. What can we learn from this story, my friends? We learned that great things are never easy. We learned that sometimes the world is not ready for a big dream. But if the dream is strong enough, it will survive. The Opera House is a monument to human imagination. It shows us that beauty is worth the struggle. It shows us that even when there is conflict and heartbreak, we can create something that lasts forever. Next time you see a picture of those white sails, I hope you remember Jørn Utzon. I hope you remember the lottery tickets, the engineers, and the workers. I hope you remember that this building is not just made of concrete and tile. It is made of dreams, courage, and a love for the sea. Thank you for listening to this story with me. It is a powerful reminder that the most beautiful things in life often come from the hardest journeys.